Hi, my name's Rob Steinberg, and I'm a classical pianist, and I'm here today to talk about how musicians elicit the strongest emotional response in their audience. And there's basically one way that they accomplish this, and that is through contrast. The fact that contrast is so important to eliciting emotional response in audiences is obvious from the most emotional music. For example, in romantic music, generally considered the most emotional in the classical field, the sonata form goes from a fast movement to a serene, slow second movement, then generally to a very quick, fast ending movement. In pop music, the pop singer Adele, who is generally considered to have the most emotional music in today's world, she focuses very heavily on contrasts. For example, her songs generally contain many appoggiaturas. An appoggiatura is a musical expression in which notes go up or they go down, going to a dissonant and then resolving. So, for example, in Adele's song "Someone Like You," it has a passage, very familiar passage, that goes like this. Those last two notes are an appoggiatura. And a study was done by a British psychologist. He had participants identify the most emotional songs, and of the 20 pieces identified, 18 of them contained appoggiaturas. In a study done at the University of British Columbia, the psychologist focused on what were the characteristics of the music that had the strongest emotional response, elicited the most goosebumps from a physiological standpoint, created a very strong response in the listener. And what they found was changes in volume, sudden changes in volume, timbre, harmonics were what created emotional response. Now, as a performer, and it doesn't matter if you're a classical performer, a jazz performer, a pop performer, the same rules apply. You can use contrast to elicit emotional response. And what I'm going to do in this video is talk about the 5 laws of contrast. These are how a performer creates emotional response, and in every piece, probably all 5 should be used, or at least considered. And the 5 laws of contrast to elicit emotional response are horizontal dynamic contrast, vertical dynamic contrast, rhythmic contrast, mood contrast, and something I call source contrast. Let's begin with horizontal dynamic contrast, which is a type contrast virtually every musician uses to evoke emotion. So I'll start with Brahms' Intermezzo Opus 116 number 2. It starts with a 4-measure line, and I will create contrast in that line to evoke emotion. So the phrase started soft, built, and then resolved to a softer level, a softer dynamic level. That's horizontal contrast, and it's obvious and used by virtually every musician. But you probably noticed that in doing that phrase I did something else. I had vertical dynamic contrast, which is the second law of contrast. I didn't play the chords all at the same level with all notes sounding the same. It wasn't. Instead it was. Now the contrast can be within a chord, or if you're a pianist, you could have the right hand louder than the left hand, bringing out the melody line more. Let me give you an example, a Chopin Nocturne. That contrast between the melody line and the accompaniment line, that also evokes emotional response. Another example would be Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, generally considered a very emotional piece. I could play it. And it doesn't evoke much emotion. However, if it's played like this, it'll evoke much more emotion. Tell the tremendous difference and the different feeling you probably have as a listener between the contrast of the two. In addition to horizontal, vertical contrast, there's also something called rhythmic contrast, which I consider very important. Because what rhythmic contrast does is allow you to build the contrast in between silence and sound by doing different types of asymmetry or different types of weighting. Let me give you an example in Chopin's Prelude No. 4, which is considered one of the most emotional pieces ever written. Probably notice that in the bass line it's just very simple. It's just a straight dot 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 dot. But instead of just doing it like that, what I did instead was by that slight weight, that slight asymmetry, it creates interest and also creates emotion. And I think in that piece you notice me doing all three of the first three laws of contrast. There's a phrasing line. I was bringing out the melody line over the accompaniment line, and I had the rhythmic contrast in there. So that was incorporating all three. And in the Brahms, the other pieces, I would incorporate all three. Another important element in all of this is that there also be mood contrasts. I'd like to play the first, I would say it's about the first 12 measures of Brahms' Intermezzo Opus 116. Number 2, listen for the horizontal dynamic contrast, the lines in each 4-measure phrase. It has a shape to it. Notice how I bring out the melody line in the chords, and notice the sudden mood contrast which will occur near the end of it. So in that passage from that piece, we heard the phrasing